All right, folks, welcome. We're so glad that you're able to join us this evening. My name is William Roca. I am the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. This evening, we're giving you the presentation of We Started a Nightclub, the birth of the Pyramid Cocktail Lounge as told by those who lived it, with Susan Martin and Kestutis Nakas, and moderated by Yael Friedman. And before I introduce our guests this evening, if you're joining us for the first time and you haven't heard of Village Preservation before, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We were founded back in 1980, and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage and character of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've secured landmark preservation designation, pardon me, for over 1,250 buildings, and we host over 75 free programs like this throughout the year. So if you see that QR code there on your screen, please take a moment to scan it. It will take you to our website. Consider leaving a donation. Those, of course, are always welcome. But I also highly recommend that you do consider becoming a Village Preservation member. This gives you advance notice of all our programs, and it's really how we make the work we do possible. But no matter if you're a member or not, please go over to villagepreservation.org, learn more about the advocacy work that we do, the different types of programs that we have, and we have a whole bunch of different resources available for free, whether you're a member or not, on our website, from maps of the neighborhood with different themes. So you would be able to put together your own walking tour of the neighborhoods, for instance. And we also have an image archive. So when you have a moment, head over to preservation.org. And just so you know, our August programs have not yet been announced, but they will be announced in the next couple of days. So you'll be able to see what we have available next month. Now for our speakers this evening. Our moderator, Yael, is a writer and editor for outlets such as The Economist, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Forward, Haaretz, Urban Omnibus, Bloomberg City Lab, and elsewhere. She writes about art, architecture, culture, and cities, most especially the one that raised her. A native New Yorker, she has gravitated not only towards New York's own built environment and sociopolitical history, but those of other places and spaces as well, with essays ranging from personal reflections on Rockaway in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, the role of public art in Miami Beach, and true story of Kitty Genovese and her legacy, the history of the Automat, and the founding of the Howell Archives. Through all of these, she's been guided by the eternal questions of what role culture plays in the life of a city and what kind of a city and society we want. Susan Martin is a producer, curator, and co-author of the book that we're talking about this evening, We Started a Nightclub, by Damiani Books, pardon me there. She's director of Some Serious Business, a nonprofit hub for resources to incubate, germinate, and present new projects in the arts and culture, recognized for her innovative collaborations with groundbreaking cultural creators and institutions. She's worked with prestigious galleries and museums, foundations, and performance venues, including California Institute of the Arts, Center Pompidou Foundation, Howell Happening NYC, The Kitchen, La Mama, Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Semotex, Site Santa Fe, and the Worcester Group. As a producer, she's collaborated extensively with visionary artists, many of the earliest stages of their careers, including Laurie Anderson, Penny Arcade, who, by the way, won a Village Preservation Annual Award this year at
That's
our June
right.
event.
That's right.
Linda Benglis, Lucinda Childs, Guy de Cointet, Marcel Zama, Karen Finley, Diamanda Galas, Philip Glassen Ensemble, Jenny Hausler, Louise Lawler, Lydia Lunch, Linda Montano, Meredith Monk, Herman Nitsch, Namjoon Paik, Rachel Rosenthal, William Wegman, Lawrence Weiner, Robert Wilson. And she goes wherever the art takes her and lives at the end of a dirt road on a mesa in northern New Mexico, where she's joining us from this evening. Kestutis is co-author with Susan and Brian Butterick of the book that we're talking about, We Started a Nightclub. His stage work has been presented at La Mama, Dixon Place, PS 122, St. Mark's Church, 8 BC, and many other venues. His works include Railroad Backward, Remembrance of the Things Pontiac, The Andrew Carnegie Story. He's emeritus professor of the theater at Chicago College of Performing Arts at Roosevelt University in Chicago. His performance text about urban beekeeping, No Bees for Bridgeport, was published in Animal Acts Performing Species. Today, an anthology of new performance edited by Una Chowdhury and Holly Hughes, University, Michigan Press. A bilingual edition of his critically acclaimed tragicomedy cycle, When Lithuania Ruled the World, is published by Oxus Zovis Vilnius. In 2017, he presented Channel D, a new solo show at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City, in conjunction with their acquisition of his video archive. In his newest performance, Revenge of the Dummy, he fools around with ventriloquism. So welcome very much. Before I hand it over officially, just some quick Zoom protocol. Throughout this evening's talk, please feel free to pop comments and questions in the chat and in the Q&A feature, and we will get to those towards the end of this program. But Yael, I'm going to hand it over to you. I will disappear in the shadows and pull up your slideshow.
William, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to be here today with Susan and Kestutis. It's quite an honor to get to moderate this discussion about their amazing book. So as William noted in my bio, I'm from here. I've been in New York City most of my life, but unfortunately, I'm just a little bit too young to have experienced the incredible burst of talent, expression, experimentation, and gender and genre bending that the singular institution that was the pyramid was. But I'm very grateful for this oral history because it brings it to us. It is exhaustive in the best sense of the word. It is a true artifact and it captures all the voices. And you get to live and breathe what the pyramid was. There are so many parts of our city, physical, social, historical, people, scenes, art forms, and movements that are lost to us because we don't realize they have to be preserved. And we assume our memories are enough somehow, and that people will care enough to be curious. But it's become clear that it's an immense effort to revive and preserve the past. Not only for posterity, but because we're all its direct descendants in one way or another. It can also, especially the pyramid, offer us alternatives and possibilities that the last couple of decades seem to have paved over, literally and figuratively. And before we dive in, I want to just read a little bit from the book. I suspect that most of you joining us know a fair bit about the pyramid, but for those who don't, this is from page 23. A vacuum filled. After its opening, the pyramid quickly became a gathering place for a new generation of artistic, post-Stonewall gays. Securely out and in pursuit of multiform entertainments, they were quite willing to mix with straightists and clientele. These straights might be self-identified as punk, new, no wave, skinhead, bi, free-spirited, or just weird. Many were seeking the same thing as their new gay friends, artistic and personal expression outside of mainstream culture and nightlife. The pyramid filled a downtown cultural vacuum as attention shifted away from CBGB's, the Mud Club, and Club 57 toward the opening Eastern Front. So, Susan and Kestutis, let's begin with why did you decide on oral history in capturing this really important era and place?
I can answer that because I was there when Brian Butterick said that it should be an oral history. Brian is the other co-author of this book who passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, and he was a key figure at the Pyramid from its beginning. He'd been one of the principal managers. He had been in a band, Three Teens Kill Four, that played there a lot, etc., and was a really well-known and innovative drag queen. But and quick story, I'll really promise, Susan, I'll make it quick. It was 2005. The annual event Wigstock had been going for years already. It was a Pyramid originated idea of performing out in Tompkins Square Park in drag mostly. And, Brian Butterick, or Hattie Hathaway, his drag name, had become a fixture at Wigstock. I was at Wigstock in 05. I had no longer lived in New York, and had fond memories of the Pyramid. Always wondered why there had never been a book about it. And there I saw Hattie in about 8 feet tall in this giant Louis XIV wig and whole drag costume. And I said, Hattie, why don't we do a book on the Pyramid? And he said, yes, I want to tell my story, and I want it to be an oral history. I want everybody to tell their story. And that's why. And that we discussed it more later, this and that and whatever, but that really was the guiding ethic, that it was the Pyramid was a collection of really unique weirdos, and it really would be best served by hearing their voices as best we can reproduce them, in print. So that's why an oral history. I mean, we wanted all those points of view. We wanted all those, as George Bush used to say, points of light. Pardon the expression. So, it's a neat, and we think that kaleidoscope perspective, or that mosaic, best represents the club. Susan, would you agree, or would you add something?
Well, yeah, I would add that, as it turns out, the format oral history is very interesting in terms of telling a story. It's very different than one narrative voice. And so what happens is the whole, I believe, becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And suddenly you have all these wonderful individual stories and voices, but there's a kind of gestalt that's created that really gives you an idea of what the time was like, warts and all. It's not filtered. It's in any way, it's pretty pure what people say.
Were there any oral histories that you took as an inspiration for this?
Well, I always loved the book Edie, the story of Edie Sedgwick, but that's just one. I'm a drama person. Drama is about multiple points of view. It's ever since the Greek, it's been one view and another, and you draw your own conclusions. And in our book, there's even disagreements. People sometimes contradict each other, which we left all that in. A lot of that was so subjective, the people's personal experiences, and even their memories. And we know that memory changes over time. So let's leave in the contradictions, they're great.
That's wonderful. And that was about 2005, I think, that you and Brian had this conversation.
When I met Brian, and we decided to do that. And then in 2006, we started in earnest collecting stories, interviewing people, and it just took years. And then we were finished mostly substantially by about 2012. And then we were looking for publishers, and then other things happened, like illness, and there were Pyramid events. There was a notable event at Howl that Susan helped promote. And one thing we never had were the wonderful press releases from that era that Susan wrote, that we actually didn't persuade Susan to allow us to include till after Brian had died, because
Well,
Susan came aboard, to help edit and, and do a final form of the book. And thank God she agreed. They're my favorite part of the book. I was reading them today and laughing, just
well,
laughing.
I remember Brian telling me all about the book, of course, and because we were good friends, long after the heyday, and I just kept on saying, "Who's going to want to read those?" And
They're wonderful.
he really insisted,
Yeah.
and I'm glad he did. And I reread them then after all those years, and saw that there was a lot of humor and a huge record of people who had performed. Just
They're
hundreds
incredible.
and
Really.
hundreds of people, and yeah, and the tone was very funny, and that's all about Bobby, who we'll get to, and Brian together, and yeah, so.
So tell me, both of you, how you came to the club, and you can also talk about Brian, but yeah, all three of you, how you tell me your personal stories of how you arrived to work with Bobby Bradley, and then also Brian's story.
Susan?
Okay, well, like so many others, I was involved in the downtown performance and experimental music scene. And a lot of this music was not performed in clubs. And I made the trek, like so many others, down to Bobby's cubicle, made out of plywood, to pitch Reese Chatham, a guitar player who's quite well known, whose fugues were just ear splitting. So I wasn't at all certain that this was going to go over. And of course, Bobby said yes. And as Anne Magnuson says in the book, it was one giant yes. Bobby said yes. He said yes. And, we sealed the deal with some drugs and click glasses. And then the next person came. And that night of Reese's gig was just, the club was filled was overflowing, and I did PR, but there's no accounting for the number of people that showed up that night. And I staggered home with $600 tucked in my pantyhose, because that's what you did. And I think Bobby noticed there were a lot of people. And shortly thereafter, he asked if I would do PR for the club, which of course I was delighted to do. And, little did I know it would turn into such an incredible collaborative experience in every way, from Bobby and Brian to the artists who performed there. And leading into Kestutis, one of the things that just blew me away when I did PR was Kestutis's Titus Andronicus, which was on the tiny little stage at 10 in the evening, and it was billed as Shakespeare's worst play. And they handed out meat to the audience. It was bloody. It was absolutely hilarious and beautifully staged. And that was it. I was sold completely.
And I mean, just to be, and I'll tell you how that happened, the Titus thing, but when we talk about, I know a lot of people listening are familiar with the pyramid. They know who Bobby Bradley is or was. But if you're not that familiar, Bobby Bradley was the very young, at the beginning of the pyramid, he was 23 years old. He was this creative spark plug that ran the place. He got it going. He had help, and those helpers are significant too. But he really was the engine on the team that implemented this vision that included performance, bands, theater, drag, and what have and anything weird. So, that really set the tone of the place. So anyway, in terms of my story, I was just, I was a guy, I'd gone to acting school at NYU. I got my MFA. I got a little bit of work as an actor, but not much. And so in frustration, really, I got a cable TV show called Your Program of Programs, which it was black and white. It was kind of a Dada-esque stab at early TV, but I got whatever guests, whatever eccentric or downtowny person I could find would come on my show. And people started, and at first it was all Club 57 people. Ann Magnuson had been my good friend. I pulled in John Sex and some other people, Kenny Sharp and Sang Kwang Chi. But more and more as the year, I had the show for a year, more and more pyramid people started coming, and they kept saying, you should go to the pyramid. You should go to the pyramid. And I never did. I mean, it sounded great. I don't know why I didn't make it down there. But finally, I was just done with, I was still not getting real paid work as an actor. And I was done with theater. And I said, I just want to do one more theater thing, and then I'll go learn to be a Wall Street person or something. So I did. I finally went to the pyramid, terrified, ready to be rejected because I was used to the acting game where that's all you were, was rejected. I went and saw this guy, Bobby, this kid, and I told him this idea because I'd always loved Titus, because I mean, to me, it was like a modern day splatter movie, the way it could be both horrible and funny at the same time. So and my friend Anne, I knew was interested in playing Lavinia, the ingenue who gets horribly mutilated. And so I took the idea to Bobby. I was penniless. I worked at the Strand in the basement, in shipping. I said, I got this idea for Titus Andronicus. I want to serialize it, which was an idea I got from John Jesserin. And he's like, Bobby was like, well, I guess you'd need some money to do this, right? And I was like, yeah, that's the trouble, Bobby. I don't. And before I could even finish my sentence, he asked his assistant, I don't know who it was, might have been Todd. Could you bring Kestutis here, $500? Which, at that time, 1983, for a working class kid, that was a fortune. I mean, admissions to things in the East Village were $3, So he financed it. He helped me cast it, and I got amazing people in this cast: John Sex, John Kelly, Bill Rice, the underground downtown actor and painter, just an all-star cast. Some of my friends from NYU, and we did this play, and we didn't know what we had. We just staged it as best we can, and on opening night, it was packed thanks to Susan's PR. She got us some voice stuff and all that. It was packed, and we did this crazy bloody thing. We also had meat packing, USDA stamps we'd stamp on people, Show over, silence. There was probably silence for, like 5 or 10 seconds. And Charles Ludlam and his partner, Everett Quinton, had been in the audience, and they stood up, bravo, and they led the audience in a standing ovation. And so it became a summertime New York City hit in 1983. And after that, Bobby, dear Bobby, who was so enthusiastic about people's work and could talk about it with you and all that, Bobby said, what else do you want to do? And basically gave me carte blanche to do anything I wanted to at the pyramid. So I was home, and I never looked back on legitimate theater. I had I had booze, I had creativity, I had art, I had friends, and so did all of us who found the pyramid. And that's what was extraordinary about it. It never felt like a money making machine, even though we all were paid well. It was something else. It was a kind of creative utopia that Bobby, his lover's sister, and the other people who were implementing that thing wanted to make happen. Thank God. I never left, performance or theater after that. I just kept doing stuff. And so for me, that's why, and hanging out and being a fly on the wall and living in a way, that part of my life at the pyramid was everything. It changed who I was and how I made stuff, and launched me into the next part of my life. So that's why I kept waiting. I became an academic later, And I kept waiting all through the 90s. When is the book going to come out on the pyramid? When's it going to come out? And it just never did, you know? And so, and Hattie was willing, you know, Hattie was willing to write.
I want you to go a little bit more into what was it that was so special about Bobby Bradley and the pyramid that was different than, you know, what was, yeah, than the other clubs and spaces at the time.
You know, if you look at that picture, those eyes, there was something very seductive about him. But he generally loved people, especially creative people. He was very, very worldly. He he grew up traveling the world. His father had been an engineer who worked internationally. He spent time in Swiss boarding schools. He grew up partly in the Philippines. You know, he had been all over, and he was a gay Mormon. His mom was Mormon, and I think he had suffered from, and I don't know the details of this, but I think he was injured a little bit from, you know, those Mormon attitudes towards gayness in that time when he was growing up in the 50s and early 60s. So, you know, I don't know, but he was a live wire. He had, you know, he'd studied philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He had a Southern hospitality type of way that he brought to New York. He was a newcomer to New York, and he had a very refreshing sense of hospitality. So all those.
And you know, the thing I think that is most important about Bobby was that he created this atmosphere of collaboration. There was no competition between people. On the contrary, everyone was rooting for you to be a complete success. And I think I mentioned there was a story that Taboo tells about wanting to do a performance, and he made the trek down to the plywood office closet and pitched what he wanted to do. And he hadn't done drag before either, Taboo, Stephen Tajan. And Bobby said yes, of course, because Bobby always said yes. And he said, but first you have to perform in Wendy Wild's show. And Wendy Wild was putting together a show, and Wendy and Stephen didn't know each other, Taboo. They didn't know each other. And so he put these two really big talents together. And that, I think, is part of what was magical about him. He was very intuitive and actually really smart. You know, he had that smile, that laid back, those beautiful eyes, but he was so smart. And Wendy actually gave Stephen Tajan his name. She said, well, if you're going to do drag, you have to have a name. And she named him Taboo. But that was Bobby. That was exactly what Bobby was like. You know, he was wide open. And then you say, how was it different from other clubs? Well, we weren't really a club. We were a dive. We didn't have the Steve Rubel money or the area money. It wasn't that at all. So it was the whole East Village and the downtown scene was do it yourself. So it wasn't about money, and it wasn't about celebrity. And they had, Sister and he had consciously left those other clubs to do something different. They didn't like how it was done. And also because they were gay, they were able to attract this sort of younger gay crowd who were actually in rebellion against the West Village. These were East Village kids, and as Kestutis had pointed out, of course, we would all have loved to live in Greenwich Village, but no one could afford to live in Greenwich Village. So we all were in the East Village, and this whole group of people that Bobby attracted were very different than, you know, the sort of clony West Village. And Brian, for example, was a punk. He had a mohawk. when I first met him. So, Bobby had a vision of something that was more inclusive and very new. There were clubs, in all fairness, Danceteria, but again, Danceteria is a multi-level, backed by who, we won't say, but the two entities that you had to have if you had a nightclub, the mob and the police, and so, it was just entirely different. The decor, it was funky. It was a neighborhood dive.
And
And
it also had a variety of art forms. It wasn't just experimental theater, it wasn't just music, it wasn't, it had, which is all in itself very different.
very different. And, we did spoken word before people really did that. And as Lydia says in her quote, she was able to bring her friends in. There was a lot of that. You didn't really have to prove yourself. You just had to go down and talk to Bobby, and that was it. There was no whole bureaucratic procedure,
If Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer had been able to come to the New York City in the 80s and they would go to the pyramid and do something really fun there. That's kind of like the spirit of Bobby. Let's just play the do something. Oh, that's ridiculous. Do that, or there's this movie or there's this record. So yeah, I mean, and talk about decor. Susan mentioned decor. Pyramid decor changed once a week. An artist
sometimes daily. Sometimes
and
daily.
Bobby would, yeah, and it would be foam core, sometimes cardboard, and Bobby would pay for it every time, and it'd be beautiful. Young artists were dying to do these environments,
And very different from I don't, people remember area and those windows walking in, very elaborate, very yeah. Well, no, this was trash from the street, basically.
Yeah, and the displays at area that was beautiful, but they were completely separate from the audience. They were displays. You didn't have contact with them. And the bar dancers at the pyramid talked to you. You had contact with the living art that was wafting through the pyramid.
And
So,
also, it wasn't about money and celebrity. So, there's that story about Tanya. Was it you that walked into the club, Kestutis? I'm not sure, but in any case, you would walk. Oh, this is in the introduction. You walk into the club, and there's Tanya with a microphone who announces your name, and everybody stops and claps. And you're just a kid from the East Village. You're not Andy Warhol or, there was none of that sense of cultivating money or in fact, I think Brian says that there were two prices at one point where if they saw a limousine draw up, it was $5 more to get in the club than it was if you just walked up to the door. So,
can you tell us more about individuals who were institutions there, like Tanya Ransom and John Sachs and, John Jassurin?
Frederick Nunley.
yeah.
I mean, there were from the very beginning, people came in who made it their creative home. John Kelly is a very notable one because he was there opening night and he really created something unique and original. He had these sort of larger than life, usually female characters, sort of an operatic dimension that sang operatically or performed really exquisite movement pieces through the club, and like night after night, and from day one he did a performance of Saint Sebastian getting hit by arrows, and it was sensual, it was erotic, it was homoerotic and just beautiful. And so there's some who had left American Ballet Theater. He basically rejected fame and that kind of mainstream art thing for the experimentation of the pyramid. Frederick Nunley is someone who became a fixture there, just performed every night, performed in people's pieces and danced on the bar. Ethel Eichelberger, who performed everywhere, but made the pyramid really kind of an artistic home. When she wasn't performing somewhere else, she would dance on the bar at the pyramid, did wonderful one-person shows, often on classical themes. You know, she's like 6'30" or whatever, really tall drag queen, and played the accordion. Phoebe Legere, who performed everywhere, but she's the one who said on opening night and that after she played for the pyramid crowd, she didn't care about Warhol anymore. She just wanted the love of the pyramid crowd. Anne Craig, who was,
Craig,
you
yes,
know,
and
razor thin woman who was just a fountain of verbal spew, who did these things called astral flashes, sort of astrology, new agey message done with reverb to introduce acts like John Jusserin's play Chang in a Void Moon. That was a weekly serialized thing. And she was just, there was nobody like Anne. She was out there. And there's a shot from Chang, by the way, that's John Kelly up above. Another actor, Larry Maxwell, on the left and below. You know, there were the tech crews.
there was something called the Pyramid Players too. That is many of the people that Kestutis has been naming, Tanya and John and Magnuson, and there were many. So they really we literally called them the Pyramid Players because they would be in crazy, you know, themed, you know, evenings all together, and then, you know, one day it would be this one day it would be that one leading the crowd. So yeah, there was actually a group that performed over and over together in different incarnations and different people's stories, you know, or plays or whatever they were, drag extravaganzas. But again, like if you look at this picture on the left and you look at that is Tanya Ransom at the mic, the kind of drag was very different than the West Village drag. That drag is not, you know, glamour drag. It's anything goes drag. And so, you know, that I think was a very important part also of the pyramid. The first time I saw Hattie, or Loretta, she had many personas. That's Brian Butterick, aka Hattie. She came out in a house coat with her hair in curlers. I mean, really not attractive, you know, like not trying to be glamorous at all. So, yeah, there was a big interchange between these performers.
Right.
And that picture on the left, that is Anne Craig in the lower right corner, John Kelly with the headband, Frederick Nunley on the left, Lynn Grabowski, who took a lot of the pictures in our book, really notable pyramid photographer. This is very early. This is before there was a stage or anything. They hadn't even covered up the back windows yet. So this would have been the early days of the pyramid.
And there was really, I think, the audience was a very important part and what set the pyramid apart from other players in terms of performance. So the players and the individuals who were performing were interplaying with each other, but I think the audience was a major part of it also.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, in Titus, you know, it never happened to me before or since, you know, as a theater person. But you had, like in Shakespeare's time, you had the groundlings, the people yelling back at the stage. And so we had audience participation from beginning to end by the audience, and our actors knew how to work it, especially Eric James, who tragically died of AIDS like a year later, wonderful African-American actor. He really got the audience rooting for the villain, Aaron the Moor. But the thing is, it wasn't conventional heckling. They were talking back, but right in context with the action, and sometimes even on the meter of iambic, it was just an incredible thing. And you're talking about a drinking crowd, but there were no FUs, no ins, it was just
Well, wait a minute, wait a minute. I beg to differ. There there were people who came expecting to get into that back room at 10 o'clock and dance. And there were people who were very disappointed and who did heckle, maybe not you and Titus, but there were people that were,
Unhappy.
unhappy. And there's Lydia's quote about being able to out heckle the hecklers, So if you were Lydia, or if you were doing something that, I don't want to be disdainful of the bridge and tunnel crowd, but there was a crowd that expected to come and drink and dance. And at midnight, when it was interrupted with some kind of weird, the Spider Queen from the Crab Nebula with Tanya Ransom and all these people that, I don't know if they didn't throw things or anything, but they were not like happy, it's like, but DJ,
Can
screaming.
you kind of break down the physical space of the pyramid and what was
Sure.
happening where? Yeah.
There was you came in, and as I said, it was a dive. So you came into the bar first, and then there were double doors, and those would open at 10 o'clock. And there was a dance floor, small, and a very
And
small
first, when you
stage.
came in, there was a bouncer, right? Or
Oh yeah,
not
there were bar
bouncer, but there
dancers.
was,
Yes, of course. There were
Yeah.
there were dancers on the bar.
Go dancer. Yeah.
And eventually, and I'll let Kestutis talk about the downstairs and what it was like, but eventually there was a lounge downstairs, and it was renamed, and various things would go on down there as well. When the club first opened, there was a stream that went across the basement floor, and the dressing room was just
Wild. Yeah.
just wild. So and then there was a very small stage, which made these theatrical performances even more dynamic. You just couldn't believe the way these things were staged on this tiny stage. It was miraculous and enchanting. And then there was a dance floor, and there were great DJs too, of course.
There was one person in the book, sorry, Kestutis, who said while he was in the audience, he couldn't imagine all the like amazing machinations of being able to change backstage that must have happened because people were coming in and out. And then once he was backstage as a performer, he saw the mess that it was. And I think it's like, the making palpable just how intimate and yet, kinetic the energy was. The book does a really good job of that.
Yeah, there used to be a ladder from the basement up onto the stage that people would, kill themselves getting up and down. Yeah, it was pretty great.
Yeah, it was DIY and small and intimate, and yet these incredible shows were, being put on almost every night.
Yeah, I mean, the dressing room was one area on the extreme, like west wall of the basement of that basement lounge Susan described, which they usually called the mood lounge. And it was all the drag queens would kind of like elbow each other out there. One time, famously, the Red Hot Chili Peppers were playing, and apparently they stole all the drag queens' boas and costume elements and wore them out on stage, and they really got they
I don't know if that was in the book.
People were, but yeah, the downstairs was called the Mood Lounge, and there were a lot of special events down there. They had a live tarantula named Eureka that lived in a television set terrarium.
Boy, that's Eureka's, and we would advertise the feedings of Eureka in the press releases too. Like come and watch Bobby feed the tarantula. That the television set you see Bobby leaning on in the previous slide was Tarantula's home, and I mean, I'm sorry, Eureka's home, and Eureka came from Pasadena. For a while, it was called the Pasadena Safari Lounge.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Pasadena Safari Lounge, based on the fact that who knows what sex it was.
There was
It
an
had,
electric train set down there with a little town with a dog food factory and a little billboard that said Alpo or whatever. And there were just a lot of eccentric things, but it was a hangout. And,
Yeah.
if there were quote unquote, I know Hallie, who was the bartender down there, was so proud that the Ramones hung out there and she served them and everything. But really that wasn't, people would come down, the Charles Ludlams would come down and say hi and whoever, but it was really communal, convivial. It didn't feel like some very exclusive thing. It wasn't
it
really,
wasn't a VIP lounge.
wasn't like that.
Okay.
Sometimes Bobby would
Uh,
have you into his little cubicle and give you some lines of Coke, which is he was kind of known for. But
Mhm.
other than that, it really was a very special place of togetherness, really, for performers and the sort of extended groups of friends. So, yeah.
Susan, can you talk a little bit about your press releases and maybe read one for us?
okay,
Read some one? Yeah.
I don't have one to
Oh
read.
no, there's one. We have a slide of one.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, that's back.
Yes.
Yeah, well, at that time it was pre-digital, and these press releases were really inspired by, I would sit downstairs with Bobby, and Bobby would be in his cubicle and Brian would be next to me. We'd all have drinks. We'd do an occasional line of blow, as Kestutis mentioned. That got us fueled. But the tone of these releases and the humor in these releases really come from collaborating with those two. And the idea of doing an introduction was mine. I felt like, when Bobby says something like, okay, the theme of this month is going to be fish, so fish, like, what do you do with fish? And it felt a little bit, because everything was pre-digital, and that meant that I had to talk to the acts, that I had to meet with the acts, that everything needed to be typed up, Xerox, folded, stuffed, and put in an envelope. But those press releases were actually really addressed to our audience, even though they might not have seen them. And at the end, Brian and I created a press release called Pyramid Poop, where we gave it a number and a volume number, and we wanted people to respond, but of course nobody did. But it was, we made fun of ourselves. We made fun of just about everything in those press releases, and they end up reading a little bit like, I like to think of them like Fenatone's, the Lucy, oh, I'm blanking. Anyway, there was they're like little novels in 3 lines. I had to write 2 weeks worth, sometimes hundreds of acts. And so you had to boil it down. And the tone was always satiric, and the tone was always, something to make you laugh. And again, I don't think I could ever have duplicated that tone without Bobby and Brian. They were just so smart and so funny that it inspired me.
And I think, go ahead, Kestutis.
Oh, I was just going to say that what happened was Susan would write these incredible things that I still laugh at all the time, but it was like they would filter around because the talent would read what was read about them. And then so many of the jokes and the little constructions and concepts were so catchy and so good that people would talk about it. So they formed this kind of ethos, like the kind of humor that flew at the club, and so they had tremendous impact, I think, while they were being written, even if you didn't end up seeing these things in the press so much, at least the way Susan wrote them, you know.
Oh, they're wonderful. I feel when I talk about the book as an artifact, it's, you know, it's the pictures, it's the people, but it's Susan's press releases that are in it. I'm so glad that you agreed to have included.
Oh, well, listen,
They're
once I reread them, I realized there was a place in the book for them, you know,
oh,
and when
absolutely.
I started, when Kestutis invited me in to help edit and refine the book after Brian died.
Yeah.
And I had to by the way, all of these I had to transcribe because nothing was, you know, nothing was digital. And I like to say that my big technology at that time, besides the telephone, was whiteout. You know, whiteout was my friend.
Uh,
I don't even
tell me a little bit about the kind of, so I think still the startup West Village versus East Village versus even different bars and different scenes in the East Village. And I think, you know, maybe the Village Voice wasn't as attentive to certain places. How would you describe that landscape?
well, I definitely felt that these younger gay guys and straight people too were in very much in rebellion and against sort of clonedom. And so you know, there was even a group, although it wasn't a group, called Fags Against Facial Hair, though that was actually sort of just an ad hoc group, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And yeah, the whole sensibility, there were, you know, around the pyramid grew up all kinds of other clubs, and don't forget the art scene was just burgeoning at that time. At the time of the pyramid too, there were just galleries popping up left and right. So the whole feeling of the East Village was DIY, but people were doing it. They were out there doing it. And that was very, very energizing. You know, nothing, money kind of didn't stop people from opening a bar or putting on a play or you know, yeah. So I think in that way it was incredibly vital. Or you'd walk down the street in the East Village and you'd run into someone and you'd start to talk, and the next thing you knew, you were doing something together. It was very much
And I
that.
think that kind of fluidity, I think, goes in so many different directions in the pyramid, especially. And I think that you know, artistically, so the East Village generally, but I think at the pyramid, especially, including, you know, it was not a gay club or a gay scene. It was maybe the queer culture filtered into everything, which I think is something you said in the book, Kestutis, but it was very fluid and very open to everyone, which I think is really one of the most extraordinary things about it.
You know, there was a time in the West Village when you had places like Cafe Chino that were completely innovative and new. And that's, you're talking about the early 60s off Broadway. By the time of the 80s, you know, and gay life was alive and well. I mean, it wasn't like dying or anything, but it was it had gone corporate. I mean, everybody looked like the Marlboro Man or one of the Village People, like at this mass level. And fine, whatever, but it wasn't even in that scene. I think for young gay men, it didn't feel like there was room for them really to be themselves. Now, for like a straight young artist or theater person, you know, if you were going to get cast in something, it would probably be like a Sam Shepard play. You know, there was a certain kind of normative limit too, that even though it was somewhat experimental and had been edgy not that long ago, it was still in the post-punk era. You weren't really that anymore either, you know, as a straight or bi or just weird person. So you know, what was that? So
And
this Clones Go Home thing, you know, that was a stencil designed by Keith Haring, and he spray painted it around the East Village, and that really became a defining thing, and that people really subscribed to the ethic. Nobody wanted to see Mr. Marlboro Man in the West Village, and no one really wanted to see young Sam Shepard in the pyramid much either. I mean, At least I think, or maybe I just didn't. But it just so this idea of just what Susan says, DIY, go for it. Just do something. I'm not going to get cast in the public in the next Sam Shepard play. I'm not going to, period. Go to the pyramid
And
or don't work or don't do anything.
although
So
just to be clear too, John Kelly met Tanya Ransom at the Anvil. So it wasn't as though people didn't go to the West Side. They went to the West Side. But
yeah,
then there was
well, the Anvil started New Wave Night. I mean, the Anvil was really the first to break that mold of at least try something new, So that's where and then Tanya and I don't know, I think John too. Frederick knows.
John Kelly said he used to sit on the steps at the Anvil and sketch.
Yeah. But they also did
But-
they lip sync to Uta Hagen and stuff at the Anvil.
Yeah.
So yeah. I mean the Anvil, but that was,
well,
considered an extreme place too.
right. And it was a place that actually people encountered each other, but they came east to the pyramid for the full flourishing of those kind of collaborative friendships that were begun there.
Frederick's got a note here. The Anvil is where Tanya started doing his drag lip sync, and he begged them to create that New Wave Night. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right.
And I think, we have to touch a little bit upon how things changed, both with Bobby and with AIDS coming later, but also as a way to underscore how special it was before, because I think with AIDS came a more compartmentalized everything. It changed. Obviously, you lost people, but it also changed the way gay culture flourished or didn't in the city. If you want to talk about that at all.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I know you mentioned that Brian had said that, and I'm sure that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I think that at the beginning of AIDS, the dots were not put together, so that at the pyramid, it was shocking and terrible, but also people were celebrated because I don't think anyone got yet, at least during the period that the book the book covers, what was coming. Okay. So there was celebration of the deceased and dear friends, and there was also the beginning of activism. There were benefits, there were, but at that point, I don't think people honestly really comprehended what was going on.
Yeah,
And
one
how
of the
special it
waves
was.
of activism really revolved around protests about the murder of Michael Stewart.
Michael Stewart, yeah. And
African-American.
Tompkins Square Park, the riots too.
Yeah. But I do think, and I would argue, and I don't know this, and I'm not a scholar of this, but to me it seems like the sheer creativity of the pyramid by this large sort of alternative gay flavored community, mostly gay, predominantly gay community, you could say. I think that was a living kind of operating entity when the anger over AIDS turned into ACT UP. And I would bet that the theatrical strategies that ACT UP employed were influenced by the kind of like rampant art making as a lifestyle that was going on at places like the pyramid, maybe not just the pyramid. But so I think that
I agree. I think there's just no question. And it reminds me a little bit of May 68 in Paris too, where artists and everyone got together and just created, disturbance and their own kind of, revolution. And I think it took on groups like ACT UP and others also took on these kind of strategies. I agree with Kestutis that were developed in a way at the pyramid. So it wasn't just, we're going to walk around with signs. We're going to do more than that.
Yeah. William, I don't know how we should deal with these questions coming in here. Someone asked where the pyramid was. That's easy at Avenue A between 6th and 7th. They're
And I'm
asking
not
about
even
the
seeing
later
it.
years.
Well, I think we're going to deal with those afterwards, right?
Oh, okay. However you want to put it, but
Can you talk about maybe as a, in closing or close to closing, sort of the arc of those years and your own arc, of those incredible, years that you got to experiment and live in this place?
who are you asking, me or Susan or both
Both
of
of you, both of you.
I
Yeah.
mean, for me,
How did
I'll
it
just
change
say
your life? How did I know? Yeah.
No, I went in at 83. I burned brightly there for a couple of years. I got very, very close to Bobby and Brian and a lot of the people and loved them and kind of checked out by 80. When Bobby got fired, I mostly left, although I did a show in 86. The later years, that's when Bobby was fired, Sister and Brian became co-managers, and the scope of our book kind of ends where they resuscitated the club. But the later years were marked by really, there was more and more drag. Lady Bunny ruled the roost for a long time. There was an amazing theatrical event called
Black Lips.
Black Lips that Brian was part of, that Anahoni, who was Anthony and the Johnsons. So there were other amazing things that bubbled up there, and even when I had gone, Taboo as sort of a resident artist there really took over, and that Taboo's aesthetic really dominated. There were a lot of things like that. It's all worth knowing. Somebody really needs to write that book about the pyramid
The
after
next,
86,
the next, the
that's
next
not
The next
decade.
one. Yes.
The next decade. Well, for me, I follow basically the same trajectory. When Bobby left, I worked for Brian for a little bit longer. I had a DIY record label called Labor Records that put out the first Swans record for those that are Swans aficionados. I managed Lydia Lunch, though managing Lydia Lunch was, very difficult. And I was pretty unmanageable too. And then I went to work for Dr. Mathilde Krim at her first foundation, the AIDS Medical Foundation. And pretty much the rest of my time in New York until 1990 was spent with her and what eventually became AMFAR, so AIDS became really, really important to me, and that's what I really concentrated on at that time, was working for Dr. Krim and for other beginning organizations like Bailey House and places like that. It was just imperative that we do something. And so that was an obvious path for me as a publicist, was to try to help correct the misinformation. And I was very lucky to have Dr. Krim, because she could answer even the craziest critics, and she looked like somebody's grandmother. And she was who everyone called upon at that time, because except for Anthony Fauci, there was nobody else who could tell it like it is, and who had the kind of humanity that she had around this issue, as well as the science. So that's kind of what I did. And I eventually got sober and dropped out. The last club I worked for was The World, and that was it. And then it was bye-bye nightclubs, period.
Yeah, do you think that, well, I think in your own press releases for the pyramid, you can see a trajectory of politics seeping in also. And I think,
Definitely.
Yeah.
It was the Reagan era, and everybody felt that. And as I said, Brian was very much of an activist, and there was Pat Buchanan. There was Koch, who didn't say a word about AIDS for, way too long. There was Ronald Reagan, who wouldn't even issue, wouldn't even, yeah. So it got more and more political. And one of the last press releases I wrote, called Whitewashing the Picket Fence, was really about that. About,
It's an extraordinary, almost historiography, looking at your press releases to, to follow this. And I really encourage everyone to, take a look at the book, because it's very, very hard, even in an hour, to get the essence of everything. But I hope that everybody can, everybody who's tuning in got some, and we're open to questions about any of this. Is there anything that you guys want to add that you don't think that we've covered?
Oh, there's so much. I mean,
I know. Yeah.
we're not going to cover it all, but that's one of the
Yeah,
fun
I'm trying
things about the
to,
book
you
is
know,
it's
yeah.
like it's a poke around. You can go forward, backward, inside out with the book and just get new nuggets everywhere. So it's just fun to read about
Wonderful.
little
Yeah.
aspects of the club.
Yeah.
yeah.
So much in there that I forget, and I have to reread it and go, oh yeah, that's what so and so.
There's
But yeah,
so
I
much
think the
great stuff.
questions there look great, so I would love to tackle some of those questions.
Yeah. Let's get to it.
I think William
Where?
William
Yeah.
is gonna come back. There he is.
Right. Yeah, I'm happy to tackle those there from the audience. This one here from Bob. Can you talk about what was going on in the East Village, what it was like around that time that you both started hanging out and working at Pyramid? How did it feel at that time? Because today it seems so different in the East Village today.
Well, it felt dangerous, for one. I mean, you had to be careful. You really did. But it also felt very, there was a great deal of camaraderie as well. It was a very mixed neighborhood, which was great in its own way. But there were also lots of drugs and drug selling, and it changed literally block from block. Like, I lived on 6th Street between A and B, which was an okay block, but 7th Street wasn't such an okay block. And if you had a social club on your block, then you felt safe because they kind of took care of their people. So yeah, no, it was you didn't cross Tompkins Square Park at night. Never. You would circumvent it, definitely. So you never knew. It was risky, but it was also exciting. And it was messy and wonderful,
Messy is a great.
Fire?
I mean, it was, Second Avenue was full of characters. You'd still see remnants. There were still remnants of the old Yiddish community. There were
Right.
still eccentric characters roaming the avenues. People left over from the hippie days of the 60s kind of burnouts. You'd see trans people, believe it or not, in little packs.
Lots of Eastern Europeans.
Eastern
Lots. There were
Europeans,
still lots of Eastern
yeah.
Europeans.
Yeah, I mean,
Eastern
you'd go to
European bars and
get a
restaurants.
a bowl of mushroom barley soup for $1. I mean, it was real cheap still. And punk kind of, there were still punks around. But it was also a time, like, I know for me, and I don't think I'm the only one. When Anne started doing Club 57 down there on St. Mark's, a lot of people, I think, just said, okay, we're just going to hang out in the East. We're not going to drag our resume uptown to 1501 Broadway or try to get an acting job or something. We're just not, we're done. We're going to do a show. We're going to go over there to this new club and meet so-and-so and hang and become kind of like the counterculture we dreamt about being when we were teenage hippies, So I think there was a lot of that. Even though you lived in the East Village, you decided to stay and hang out in the East Village too. And then you really started to meet people like you. And then you started to have casts for your shows
Right,
or people for
exactly.
your band or whatever else you're doing,
Yeah, or exactly.
So it was fun. And before it started dying because of gentrification and AIDS and the drug horror that happened, it really seemed like it was going to be an upward spiral. It was going to me, I thought it would go on forever. I never thought audiences would dry up. I never thought it would go away, and we could keep making this money. We were making decent money. Bobby would give us the whole door, and you could support your low East Village rent on your income.
What year did you both arrive in New York and in the East Village?
I got here in 76.
76.
I got there in 79.
Wow.
So I
Okay.
was a little bit
And you
later.
came here for school, Kestutis?
I came to grad school at NYU,
Yeah.
which was acting school, which, by the way, NYU has such a bad rap, and it should. It's horrible. But in those days, that school, School of the Arts on 7th Street, run by Omar Shapley, he was a totally committed East Village person. He hung out at the Orchidea every night. He held court there. He totally promoted and believed in the Ukrainian community, in all of the things that made the East Village unique, and he loved it. And he, the later times of that sort of corporate expansion, that came later. But NYU was, at least that School of the Arts, was kind of a different animal than, according to my experience. And he loved, Omar came to the Pyramid. They all came and saw
wow.
Titus Andronicus and stuff.
Wow.
They loved it, so it's kind of bitter to know the reputation they have now for being a kind of landlord.
Yeah. They own the East Village, or much of it.
Yeah, I guess that was the plan the whole time, but they actually found good people to at least run the arts.
Right. And Susan, remind me what brought you out to New York?
In one weekend, I came for a weekend. I brought my nieces, and I saw Lydia Lunch, James Chance, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks all in one weekend. And I was living with Michael Girard, who eventually formed Swans. And I went back there, and we were involved in the punk scene in LA. It was very vital at that time, but we were mostly listening to Joy Division and Suicide and No Wave and more that music. And I came back and I said, "What are we waiting for? Let's go." So I got a job working for Meredith Monk's management company, and what she had me do was PR for Meredith Monk at La Mama, and I didn't even know PR was a job. I didn't even know it was a job, and it was like, oh, you know what? I think I could do this. I can communicate, experimental ideas to smart people. And so it was completely by chance, but that's what brought me. And then I started this record label almost immediately after coming to New York, because you could back then. You did it. I wasn't the only one. There was a huge experimental music happening in the East Village and in Soho with Glenn Branca and Reese, and you could name, Fred Frith, who performed at the club, lots of people. So we haven't talked much about music, but it was also a real breeding ground. Nirvana did their first gig in New York at the Pyramid. It was a little bit
few
later
people
than,
did, right? Red Hot Chili Peppers also.
yes, absolutely.
I think
So
a bunch of
someday we'll
others,
have
yeah.
to cover the music, because the music was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it burrowed right into the core of one of the musical groups, Three Teens Kill Four, was Brian Butterick, but with David Wojnarowicz and Julie Hare, who ended up being a sort of powerful woman at the Pyramid in terms of booking things and stuff too, and Jesse Hultberg and Doug Bressler. But yeah, music, that's a whole other.
Yeah, they might be giants. It was kind of like their home.
Right. That's
Flesh
right.
Tones, yeah.
Yeah.
Mudhole Surfers, Now Explosion.
RuPaul's Wee Wee Pole up from Atlanta. I love the name
Christy
of it.
Rose. They had amazing country. Top drawer country
Yep.
music. Because Bobby loved it, and he found Christy Rose, who's just a tremendous, tremendous singer, and the Midnight Walkers.
You're great.
Katie Kay with her country costumes, Yeah, so much. It's so rich. It really is. I mean, I really feel lucky to have been there. I love that some of these people like Frederick are here, and Peter Littlefield are on this thread, and it's I think it's an important
Wonderful.
period in art, in cultural life of New York.
It's incredible. I think the variety and the richness is incredible.
Definitely.
Do we have more questions?
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions than from the audience. So I just want to say thank you, Susan, Kestutis, Yael, for this wonderful conversation, because this book is an oral history, and right here, just your discussion, I think, shows how important oral history can be at conveying those wonderful memories and help keeping it alive. So thank you everyone so much for joining this evening. I can't recommend enough to please go out and get the book to read even more about it. But again, Susan, Kestutis, Yael, thank you so much for joining us this evening, taking the time to speak and share all your wonderful memories. We appreciate it so very much. Thank you
Thank
again,
you,
everyone,
William.
for joining.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, William.
Right, then I will wish everyone a good evening and have a great time and a great summer, everyone. Stay cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.